Alright you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. So check it out you guys, I got another banger for you. And this one right here is about an East Side Cold Street gang member who ends up catching the death penalty for dropping 3 bodies. You know, it's still going to take me and Sandman a couple of weeks to get through this transition, but once we get things going the way we want them, you guys are going to start getting a lot more content. You know, honestly though, like I said in my last live, aside from me putting in the extra work, a lot of the credit goes to Sandman for taking on some of the editing and for just freeing up some of my time. Because essentially, that's kind of what made all this possible. You know, I don't want to get ahead of myself because we're just starting to bend the corner, but the objective is obviously to get the channel back to where it was and to start putting content out almost daily. So that's the goal, and like I've been saying, we're going to start diversifying the content as well. But anyways, without further ado, let's get into this next story. So this next story is going to be one of those kind of stories that has a lot of moving parts to it, and there's just a lot involved. So as you guys know, the state of California was handing out death penalty cases like hotcakes back in the 90s. And the general consensus on crime back in those days was to go hard in the paint, especially when it came to the criminal element. They pretty much prosecuted any form of criminal activity, especially as it pertained to gang members and organized crime. You know, with the exception of a few counties in Northern California like San Mateo County, Santa Clara County, and Contra Costa County, LA County in Southern California was still sending more people to death row per capita or in California than anyone else. Anyone who committed a crime that was so heinous that it shocked the conscience when you heard about the details was subject to catching a DP case. But there's still no question about the fact that gang members were still favored and preferred targets by prosecutors back in those days than anyone else. The 90s was definitely an era that wasn't a good time for you if you were an active gang member, especially if you were out there in the streets committing acts of violence and catching bodies. Unfortunately, this case was just another one of many examples that qualified as a DP case back in this time frame. So I'm going to take you guys back to October 23rd, 1997. It was sometime around 11 p.m. on that night that 4 documented gang members from East Side Cold Street were on a crime spree, basically robbing and jacking anyone that they seen or crossed paths with. So Richard Peninuri, who was also known as Dozer, Alejandro De La Losa, who also goes by Joker, Arthur Bermudez, also known as Trubs, and Jaime Castillo, who they call Solo, were all driving around together that night, hunting for potential victims. And like the title says, these guys were spazzing out. They were on a mission to get money by any means necessary. You know, not to get off track, but I've been on these same kinds of reckless crime sprees before myself, where anything goes and nothing's planned. Basically, anyone can get it, and anyone who even looked like they might have had money was a potential target. So these guys were apparently driving around on Whittier Boulevard, which is basically in the heart of their neighborhood. And there was nothing inconspicuous about these guys. I mean, I'm lightweight kidding when I say that because these guys were mobbing around in a white Cadillac that was slammed down with some low pros and some old school glass packs. 4 Mexican cats all slung back with prison ink, bald heads, riding 4 deep. You know, again, I don't want to get off track, but something that I never understood that I was even guilty of myself was why most of the time these types of crimes were committed in our own neighborhoods. Because I mean, you would think that common sense would tell you not to shit in your own backyard. But for whatever reason, it seemed like a lot of us were victimizing people in our own neighborhoods. Instead of going somewhere else to another area or another neighborhood, instead we just look for targets right there, either on or in our own stomping grounds. I mean, seriously, have you guys ever tripped on that? It makes no sense. I don't know, maybe it's a comfort thing and it has something to do with moving around in your own territory, but it's just something that never made sense to me when I thought about it. We'd rather tear up, destroy, and deface our own neighborhoods opposed to going somewhere else and doing it over there. You know, I'll move on in a minute, but this even applies to graffiti and defacing some of the buildings and walls in our own neighborhoods. I mean, seriously, when you think about it, does it make sense to any of you? You know, no doubt, graffiti and striking up the walls definitely devalues property and it eventually becomes an eyesore, but yet we continue to do it. I just think that's one of the unfortunate travesties that we bring upon our own neighborhoods. But like I said, I'm even guilty of it myself. You know, it just took me years later before the blinders came off and I finally realized how backwards things like that really were. You know, we learn how to put things like this in perspective when we open up our minds and we start to internalize how foolish some of this stuff really is. But anyways, this is what Dozer and these other 3 individuals from East Side Cold Street were doing. They were mobbing around looking for a target. Anyone who they thought might have had on jewelry, a pocket full of money, or who might have been in possession of anything of monetary value. Anyways, one of the first incidents that they would all later be charged with was an incident that was later referred to as the parking lot incident. Just so you guys understand how it all went down, let me just kind of set the stage for you and describe the events as they happened. So again, on the night of October 23rd, 1997, sometime around 11 p.m., a guy named Randy Cordero was driving his two friends, Sean Kresher and David Bellman, to a small convenience store on Whittier Boulevard called Ralph's Market. So when they got there, this guy Randy Cordero parked his black 1995 Dodge Intrepid in the parking lot. The three of them got out of the car and then they started walking towards the store's entrance. So when they were about midway towards the store's doors, Dozer, Trubbs, Joker, and Solo pulled into the store's parking lot and jumped out of a white Cadillac. Keep in mind, these guys were drinking and they were high on Chris, so they were turned up and they were just looking for victims to rob. I'm not sure exactly what was said, but according to what would come out later, Dozer, who was supposedly wearing black burners or black gloves, pulled out a knife and punched Bellman in the mouth. And then again, according to what will come out later, Dozer, who was described as wearing a black baggy jacket with a hoodie, told Cordero and Kresher to give him their money. And then at that point, Kresher handed over $40 to Dozer because, as he would later say, he assumed that Dozer had a gun. Cordero, on the other hand, refused and said that he didn't have no money. Out of these three individuals that these guys were robbing, it definitely seemed like Cordero was the one who resisted and was more willing to fight back. But these other two, Bellman and Kresher, had no interest in fighting. One of them was standing there leaking with a mouthful of blood, and the other one had already handed over his money. That's what's messed up about being in a situation like this. You get rolled up on by a crew of individuals who try to jack you and take your ride, and then the people you're with belly up from the gate and won't even help you fight back. That's how you go from being in a bad situation to being in a really bad situation. So it was at this point when this guy Cordero heard Dozer say, "Get his keys," that he turned around, ran back to his car, and grabbed a baseball bat. And that's how you know that this was definitely the 90s, because back in those days, if you weren't strapped, it was mando that you either had a baseball bat, a crowbar, a knife, or some other type of weapon in your car. Gangbanging was just different in those days. If you left the house without a weapon, it was almost like leaving the house without your keys. Don't get me wrong, gangbanging still exists today, but it was nothing like it was back in the 80s and 90s. So Cordero gets a baseball bat, but Dozer's strapped. And as soon as the bat comes out, the strap comes out. And then somebody yells out, "Blast him, smoke him, shoot his ass." So when Dozer hears that, this not only caused him to pull the strap out, but he also cocked it and pointed it at Cordero. And then later on, when Cordero would testify about the details of this incident, he positively identified the handgun that Dozer pulled out that night as being a black and gray 9mm handgun. So when Dozer pulled out the strap and drew down on these guys, they turned around and they basically cut tread. They took off running in the direction of a nearby intersection. And at that intersection, there just so happened to be several LAPD officers that had gathered up, trying to control the flow of traffic after a minor fender bender. So at that point, Cordero explains to the officers what had just happened, and then he gives them a physical description of Dozer and the other three. So after they ransacked Cordero's car, they all jumped back in the Cadillac and took off. And needless to say, by the time Cordero, Kresher, and Bellman took the officers back to Ralph's parking lot where the incident happened, Dozer and his boys were long gone. And this is also when Cordero realized that a black duffel bag that he usually kept in his car was also missing. That's something that'll end up being relevant later on in the story, and when I get to it, I'll remind you guys. So even though Dozer and the other three got away that night, this is one of the incidents that would end up coming back later on that would end up sinking them. And again, later, Cordero would identify Dozer as the one who had the weapon, and Kresher would identify Dozer as the one who punched him in the mouth. Dozer put all the work in by himself. So the following day, acting on the tip that he might have been involved, one of the detectives named Mary Hansen interviewed Joker. And according to this detective's testimony, Joker said that him and three of his homies went to Ralph's parking lot that night to use a payphone. And then Joker said that he came to the aid of one of his friends that night who was involved in a fist fight, and that at one point, one of these other guys pulled out a baseball bat. And then Joker said that eventually these three guys that they got into a fight with took off running, and that some of his friends might have picked up some of their possessions that they had dropped. That's saying a lot. Probably more than he should have. I don't know if Joker thought he was covering something up, if he was trying to account for something, but he said too much. If he wanted to talk about what he did that night, no harm, no foul. But when he talked about his boys, he put them at the scene of the crime. This interview that Joker agreed to actually ended up hurting Dozer later on in his trial, as it contradicted certain details and implicated Dozer. So this same detective, Mary Hansen, also interviewed a former East Side Cold Street gang member named Freddie Becerra, who was also known as Diablo. And the way I understood it was that Diablo was one of her CIs, and he identified several individuals who he claimed were also from Eastside Cold Street. And some of those individuals were Penanuri, Dozer, De La Losa, Joker, Castillo, Solo, Bermudez, Trubs, and Tapia, Sniper. Anyways, the second incident that occurred that night was referred to as the Hornell Street incident. And this occurred in the early morning hours of October 24th, 1997, several hours after the Ralph's parking lot incident. So on this morning, Luke Bissonette, another Eastside Whittier Cold Street gang member who goes by Youngster, and Carlos Arias, who goes by Listo, were sitting in the car eating, parked on Hornell Street near a house that belonged to Youngster's grandfather. It was early in the morning and they decided to stop by one of the local Mexican restaurants and try some of the chorizo con huevos. So at one point, Youngster got out of the car to smoke a cigarette, and that's when, out of his peripheral, he seen a white Cadillac pull up. At first, he didn't recognize the car or the four individuals inside the car, but then he seen Dozer get out and start walking towards them. Keep in mind, these guys were both from the same neighborhood, but for whatever reason, when Dozer got closer, Dozer told him to get in the car, and Youngster took off running. I don't know if these guys had some kind of prior beef or what was going on between them, but like I said, when Dozer got closer, Youngster took off running towards his grandfather's house and he hid in the backyard. Dozer, on the other hand, must have also known Youngster's mom, Roxanne Bissonette, because Dozer knocked on the front door and she answered the door. And from Youngster's vantage point where he was hiding, he could see Dozer and his mom talking, but he couldn't make out the details of what they were talking about. So Youngster's mom, Roxanne, for whatever reason, warned Dozer to stay away from her son. She told Dozer that he better not do nothing to her son. And like everybody else that came into contact with Dozer that morning, she would end up being called to his trial later on about the events that she witnessed that morning. She basically said that in the early morning hours of October 24th, 1997, that she spent the night at her father's house on Hornell Street, and that at some point she heard some loud noises outside her window that made her look outside. And that when she looked out the window, she seen a white Cadillac pull up, and then she seen several heads crossing the front yard. So she said when she opened the door, she seen Dozer and Joker standing there, with Dozer wearing a large baggy black jacket. And then she said Dozer asked her if she seen Youngster and Listo and that he needed to talk to both of them. Roxanne really didn't elaborate about any more of the details of that conversation, but she did say that she warned Dozer not to touch her son. And I'll get to this later on in the story, but Youngster also ended up cooperating and testifying against Dozer as well. They essentially brought him in as one of their star witnesses, and he connected a lot of the dots for the prosecutor. Aside from testifying about the events that transpired on October 24th, 1997, he was also a pivotal witness for the prosecutor. Like they usually do when they get a former gang member that's willing to get in the box and testify, they used him up like a dirty little sponge and milked him for everything he knew. He helped prove Dozer's membership with the Eastside Cold Street gang, and he also helped demonstrate Dozer's propensity to commit acts of violence. And anytime you have a gang member that testifies in a case like this, it's pretty compelling testimony, and the jury eats it up. Again, I don't know what the issue stemmed from or why Dozer and Youngster were at odds, but whatever it was, Youngster was extremely terrified of Dozer. So much so that he agreed to testify against Dozer and turn state evidence against him. So the next incident was referred to as the Goodhue Street incident. And it's actually a continuum of what happened on the same morning when Dozer pulled up on Youngster at his grandfather's house on Hornell Street. But for reasons concerning the criminal case, that's kind of why they have them broken up into different incidents. So when Dozer pulled up on Youngster and Youngster hid in the backyard, the reason why Youngster didn't go in the house is because his grandfather wouldn't let him in. I'm assuming it was because his grandfather felt like he was bringing too much drama around the house and that it had got to the point to where he wasn't going to let him inside anymore. At any rate, after Youngster's mom, Roxanne, had that brief conversation with Dozer that morning, eventually Youngster came out of the backyard and seeing that everybody had left. So since Youngster wasn't allowed to go inside his grandfather's house, he jogged a couple of blocks away to Goodhue Street to where his girlfriend, Lorraine Martinez, was living at that time. And when he got there, several people who he knew were all there at the house. So he went inside the house and went out to the back patio area where Listo, his sister, Laura Bissonette, Brian Molina, who also went by Oso, and Michael Murillo, who went by Bucky. So his girlfriend Lorraine and these other three were all out on the back patio when he walked up. And keep in mind, Listo was the other guy that was sitting in the car with Youngster when Dozer pulled up on him at his grandfather's house. So Oso and Bucky were both asleep on some makeshift couches that were out there on the back patio, and his girlfriend Lorraine was talking to Listo. And the first thing Listo told him when he walked up is that he almost got murked because Dozer put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger. And he said the only reason why he didn't get shot is because the gun jammed and it didn't fire. So after about 20 minutes, Youngster, his sister Laura, and Listo all went back inside the house. Lorraine, her son Eric, her daughter Monique, and Youngster's brother Shane were already inside. So it was about 10 or 15 minutes after they went back inside the house that Youngster said he heard 10 or 15 gunshots, and then he looked out the window. So later on, when Youngster testified at Dozer's trial, he said that when he looked out the window and he seen a figure running by the window, the first thing he said was, "Fucking Dozer." So Youngster went on to testify that after he heard the gunshots and after he seen Dozer run by the window, that he ran back out to the back patio where Oso and Bucky were asleep on the couches. And that's when he found them both to be suffering from what appeared to be fatal gunshot wounds. So he said he found Bucky unresponsive on the patio with 3 visible gunshot wounds in his body. And at that point, he ran back inside and told his sister to call 911. And then he ran back outside and he heard someone moaning, and that's when he found Oso with a gunshot wound over his right eye. So later on, Lorraine, Youngster's girlfriend, would also be called to Dozer's trial to testify about the things that she seen on that morning as well. And she testified that just as she started to fall asleep, that she heard something outside her window that sounded like a car backfiring. And this obviously made her look out her window. And when she looked out the window, she seen more muzzle flashes and heard more gunshots. So it was at that point that she said she ran outside and called 911. So one of the other things that she testified about that would end up being highly damaging at Dozer's trial, that when she was on the phone with the 911 dispatcher, that she heard both Youngster and his brother Shane yell out the name Dozer. So several of the neighbors that lived on Goodhue Street would also end up being witnesses at Dozer's trial as well. Some of them claim that they seen the aftermath of the shootings and that they also seen a white Cadillac take off at a high rate of speed. So one neighbor in particular named Matthew Walker, who looked out his window on Goodhue Street, testified that he saw a white Cadillac parked on the street and that it appeared to be empty. A few minutes later, he said he seen 2 guys believed to be Dozer and Solo exit Lorraine's backyard and then get into the white Cadillac and take off at a high rate of speed. And he said he seen the Cadillac drive down Goodhue Street until it was no longer visible. 2 other neighbors also testified about hearing gunshots and then seeing an older model white Cadillac take off a few minutes later. You know, needless to say, when you put all these pieces together and considering the totality of all the evidence that they had, this was also highly damaging to Dozer as well. You know, keep in mind, this was a highly publicized case and it was all over the media when it happened. Not only because it was a case involving multiple homicides and it was gang related, but also because the victims were both teenagers. You know, I'm not sure how this might have affected Dozer's status when he got to prison based on the fact that the Mexican Mafia has very strict protocol when it comes to kids and teenagers who are victimized by gang violence. But I'd be willing to bet that he probably caught some kind of flack behind it. At any rate, Dozer's crash out literally only lasted a couple hours after he allegedly committed this double homicide in South Whittier. And this is how he ended up getting caught up. So after the shooting, Solo and Dozer went to Solo's house and went to sleep. It was late, they wanted to get off the streets, and it was probably better for Dozer to stay there instead of taking a chance and trying to make it back home. So at that time, Solo was living with his uncle, Francisco Castillo. It was his uncle's house. So when they got to the house, Solo opened up his uncle's van and let Dozer sleep there. I guess Solo didn't anticipate that his uncle was going to work the next morning and that he was going to be driving his van like he did every morning. And because of this, Solo basically got his uncle caught up in this mess. So his uncle Francisco would also be called to testify at Dozer's trial. And he basically said that he seen Solo enter their house on the morning of October 24th, 1997, sometime around 7 a.m. This was around the same time that he left for work in the mornings. And from what he remembered, Solo didn't spend the night at the house the night before. So when Francisco got in his van to drive to work that morning, that's when he found Dozer asleep in his van. You know, I don't know if Francisco and Dozer knew each other prior to that morning, but just based on the fact that he was a friend of his nephew's, he agreed to drive Dozer home before going to work that morning. Anyways, as a result of some of these events and information that law enforcement apparently learned from their investigation, an officer by the name of Jeff Piper executed a search warrant at Joker's residence on the afternoon of October 24th, 1997. And during the search, they apparently found a black jacket, a black long-sleeve sweatshirt with the hood, a small black knife with a belt clip, a pair of black cotton gloves, a plastic box of 9mm ammunition with some bullets missing, keys to the white Cadillac that was parked out in front of the house, and a pair of men's socks and boxers that were found in a trash can. Now, earlier in the story, I told you guys why that black duffel bag would be relevant later on in the story. The the duffel bag that was taken out of Randy Cordero's car that was in Ralph's parking lot. Well, the socks and the boxers that they apparently found in the trash can belonged to that guy, and they came out of that duffel bag. So as you guys know, I don't always go into the legalities of what happens when the circumstances of these stories are prosecuted legally in a criminal trial. Sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. It just kind of depends on the story and how much it ties into the criminal trial. But based on the fact that this is a death penalty case and that a significant part of this story happened before and during the trial, I'm going to take you guys through some of it. So after Joker's house was hit, the lead detective, Jeff Piper, used some of the evidence from the first search to justify the probable cause standard to get a second search warrant of Dozer's house. And that's exactly what he did. So later on that same day, Jeff Piper arrested Dozer at his house. And during the search, they seized a large black jacket with a hoodie that was believed to be the same jacket that he was wearing during the Ralph's parking lot incident, the Hornell Street incident, and the Goodhue Street incident. So next, a firearms expert named Richard Catalini testified that all 11 expended casings found at the Goodhue Street location were fired from the same 9mm handgun. Catalini further testified that the expended casings matched the live ammunition that was found at Joker's house. And then of course, he went into all the intricacies of how GPR evidence, blood splatter evidence, blood striations, DNA evidence, and bullet trajectory evidence is all collected and processed. This was a death penalty case, so this guy overextended himself and gave the jury a full course breakdown on crime scene investigations and forensic evidence. All that real interesting stuff, like how a live round of ammunition can be marked by the barrel of a gun after insertion into the chamber, by the hook that pulls it out of the chamber, and by the ejector pin that tips the cartridge out of the firearm. I bet that went right over some of your heads, huh? Anyways, after comparing the markings on the live ammunition with the expended casings recovered from the scene, Catalini concluded that they were all worked through the action of the same firearm. He also testified that there were a variety of brands of expended casings found at the Goodhue Street location, similar to a variety of brands of live rounds at Joker's house. Why he was holding on to these expended rounds is a mystery that hasn't been answered, but it was definitely a case of bad judgment. So this is where the case gets interesting. Recorded jailhouse phone calls. It never fails. There always seems to be a new batch of individuals who either just don't get it or who just think they're smarter than everyone else. I don't want to get off track, but I think it's important to point this out anytime a story like this comes up or anytime someone ends up in a situation like this. If for nothing else, at least for the purpose of awareness alone. A lot of the time when we end up in a real bad situation, whether it's behind making poor choices or whatever the case might be, we end up turning to the only people we know who we can trust, and that's our families. And sometimes the desperation of that situation can cloud or have an adverse effect on our better judgment. All we really see and focus on at that time is freeing ourselves from this situation that we got caught up in. A situation that we ended up putting ourselves in. We don't see the potential risk or the exposure that we're subjecting our loved ones to until most of the time it's too late. I've even made some of these same mistakes myself. But here's the thing you should always try to remember and honor no matter how bad things get. If you're out there on the streets and you end up getting caught up behind bad choices that you made, don't expose your family to some of these things or ever put them in a position to where they might potentially get caught up themselves. You're the one that made those bad choices, but then to turn around and to put someone else at risk, someone who has an emotional attachment to you, is not only wrong, but it's just a selfish thing to do. Unfortunately for Dozer, he ended up putting his mom, Maria Penninuri, in that position, and she was forced to make some tough choices. So after Dozer was arrested, he had 2 conversations with his mom while he was still in the county jail. And both of these conversations were recorded. And as a result, both of these conversations became to be a central part of the case. In the first conversation that was played in open court for the jury that was recorded on July 19, 1998, Maria said that she had a note that she wanted to show Dozer, and Dozer assured her that the conversation wasn't being recorded. I don't know if he just told her this to put her mind at ease so that she would just show him the note, or if he really believed that these conversations weren't being recorded. But I personally have a hard time believing that Dozer didn't believe that they were being recorded. Because we're talking about a seasoned gang member that had been to the LA County Jail on several occasions prior to this. Someone who was well aware of how the jail operated. Everyone knows that the jail phones and the visiting phones are all recorded. I mean, that's just common knowledge. And there's even a short prompt that tells you that this conversation is being monitored and recorded as soon as you pick up the phone. And if by chance they're not recorded by standard procedure, then you at least know that they're subject to being recorded. And anyone who's done any real time and who's been in these types of environments would at least have a mindset of always assuming that they are either way. So during the rest of the conversation, Dozer talks about being intimately involved with his private investigator and that they were trying to coordinate an alibi for him. An alibi so that someone could say that they were physically with them at the time when these homicides were being committed. I mean, this guy basically sabotaged his own defense. That's what he did. The smart thing would have been to have the private investigator relay that information directly to his mom herself. So they go through a short list of potential prospects, and then at one point, Maria says, I even asked Jesse and Eddie. More than likely other family members. But then she says they were like, well, who? And then Maria goes on to say, and I go, well, anyone, even Aunt Lori, to say that she was with you. You know, anyone listening to that conversation, especially law enforcement, would know that he was trying to establish and pin down an alibi. So the second conversation that ended up being the worst of the two was recorded on August 15, 1998. So in this conversation, Dozer tells his mom, Maria, that Jaime Castillo, Solo, was with him that night at Ralph's parking lot. And that he was probably with Joker that night because look where he's at. He died. Someone took him out. So at that point, Dozer and his mom start talking about solidifying the timeline, trying to pin down the time that Dozer needs to say that he was dropped off. They throw different times at each other before they finally agree that he needs to say that he was dropped off somewhere between 2:50 a.m. and 3 a.m. And then Maria goes on to say that Joker better clean this shit up too. This is obviously a reference to the interview that Joker apparently agreed to with Detective Mary Hansen. You know, if you guys remember during the interview, Joker not only incriminated himself, but he also implicated Dozer and the others as well by putting them at the scene of the crime. So at some point, Dozer became concerned about the possibility of Solo cooperating with law enforcement. I don't know if he became aware of the fact that Solo might have been considering it or if he might have already started talking to one of the detectives. But he was definitely concerned, and Solo became to be a serious point of interest. I mean, who knows? Maybe he was a chameleon and had everyone fooled. You just never know in these types of situations. I mean, if you really think about it, besides some of the eyewitnesses who claim that they heard gunshots and then seen Dozer jump in the Cadillac and take off, the only one who could really hurt him more than that is Solo. If Solo flipped on him, his testimony would definitely be pretty compelling, and Dozer would be cooked, hands down. Could they do it without Solo? Probably. But with him, I think Dozer knew that he was going to get the needle. So Dozer needed to find a way to eliminate Solo and to stop him from potentially becoming to be a witness against him. And that's what he ultimately did. He began formulating a plan to take him out. So there was a number of witnesses who were all in line to testify against Dozer, including Youngster, his brother and sister, Shane and Laura Bissonette, and then some of the other neighbors who claimed that they witnessed certain aspects of the incident. But again, Solo was different. He was considered to be someone who actively participated in some of these crimes. Crimes that led up to the double homicide and then the double homicide itself. And Solo had everything to gain from cooperating. It didn't matter that he wasn't the actual trigger man. Just based on the fact that he was there with Dozer, that he was there for the same working purpose, made him just as culpable. So again, in Dozer's mind, he considered him to be a serious threat, who had the kind of information that could end up being a game changer at his trial. You know, like I said, Solo must have did or said something at a character that caused Dozer to start tripping on him. Because he wouldn't have went to these extremes just based on the fact that Solo was sitting on this information. You know, it doesn't work like that. That would have just been something that him and Solo would have took to the grave. You know, at this point, Dozer was desperate. All he kept thinking about was different ways to try to get rid of Solo. You know, it could have been the difference between a 20-year prison sentence, a life sentence in state prison, or the worst case scenario that he was trying to avoid, the death penalty. And the way that Dozer was able to do this was by enlisting the help of other Eastside Cold Street gang members that he was tight with. And one of these individuals was Cub. And trip out on this, the irony in all this is that Cub was supposed to be helping Dozer take out Solo, who was suspected of being a CI. So before I put the cart before the horse and tell you guys what happened in court, let me explain how Dozer and Cub initially planned to whack Solo. So while Dozer was still in the LA County jail preparing himself to go to trial in the double homicide that occurred on Goodhue Street, he ended up reaching out to Cub, a longtime friend and a fellow Eastside Cold Street gang member. And like most of the people that knew Dozer on the street, especially the people from his neighborhood, South Whittier, they were well aware of everybody that was cooperating against him. So at the time when all this was going on, Cub was living with his wife, Tracy McGurk, their 2 kids, and his wife's friend, Carmen Miranda. So sometime in early December of 1997, after converting the garage into another bedroom, Cub allowed one of his close friends, Joseph Castro, who was also known as Crook, to move in and live there as well. And Crook was also another fellow Eastside Cold Street gang member, and him and Cub had practically known each other for their entire lives. Otherwise, I highly doubt he would have allowed him to stay there with his wife and kids. You know, at the time, Crook had just lost his job, he fell on some hard times, and he needed some help. And here's the thing about Cub and his wife Tracy. According to everyone that knew him, they were both good parents and they took good care of their kids. But they were both the type of people that were both deeply involved with the gang. And their apartment essentially became to be like the gang's main hangout. And what I mean by that is that they always had gang members there at their apartment, and they interacted with their kids so much that even their kids thought that all these guys from Eastside Cold Street were their biological uncles. So at night, Crook would open up the garage door, turn up the oldies or the rap music, and the garage would always be full of gang members partying and drinking. The walls in the garage were struck up with gang graffiti, and there was always Corona beer bottles scattered throughout the entire garage. All over the tables, all over the floors, they'd always be everywhere. And the other thing about Tracy and Cub is that they were kind of like the hub for the incarcerated gang members who were either in the LA County Jail or somewhere in state prison. And at that time, Dozer was one of the main ones that called over there, at least once or twice a day, if not more. Also, this was back in 1998, so keep in mind that this is when the era of the burnout phones was in full effect. Everybody was doing it, and this is how everybody made their calls back then. This is how it was done before everybody had contraband cell phones. Have you guys ever tripped on that? For the past 20 to 30 years, inmates have always found a way to sidestep and manipulate the system and some of the outrageous phone charges that some of these huge phone giants were charging. The telecommunication carriers like Global Tellink, WorldCom, and some of the others that were gouging the pockets of the inmates and their families. You know, again, I don't want to get off topic, but it's crazy when you think about these things. You know, in the early 80s, when they still had coin-operated payphones, there was a way to shape a paperclip and stick it inside the phone and manipulate it into believing that money was being fed into the phone and then the call would be placed. And then years later in the 90s, like I said, the era of the burnout phones was in full effect. And this is the way that it was done until they finally shut that down. One thing's for sure, it just goes to show how resourceful and how much ingenuity inmates have when it comes to finding new ways to manipulate the phone and work the system. Whatever it took to get on the phone and cupcake to their girls, they got it done. You know, cell phones are obviously still being used, but the state of California just gave up and threw in the towel because they don't even charge inmates to make calls anymore. It went from a multi-million-dollar industry to free calls for everyone. But anyways, getting back to Cub and Tracy's apartment, all the different descriptions I gave you guys should give you a general idea of what kind of environment it was. So when Dozer would call, he would call on a burnout line that Crook had hooked up in the garage. And occasionally when Dozer would call, he would talk to Crook, but most of the time when he called, he just asked if the homies were there. And this was his way of asking if either Cub or some of the other Eastside Cold Street gang members were there. So Crook would essentially answer the call, but Cub was the one he was calling to talk to. But anyways, at some point during these conversations, the idea of silencing Solo would eventually become to be the main focus of attention, and Cub was completely on board with it. So Dozer and Cub talked about different scenarios and different ways to get it done. But for the most part, Dozer let Cub figure most of that out for himself. You know, because realistically, there was only so much that they could discuss on the phone. You know, and even though they were sloppy when it came to talking about business over the phone, at least they exercised some level of discretion. So on January 24th, 1999, Cub drove Crook, Trub, Joker, and Solo into the San Gabriel Mountains, north of the city of Azusa. And they drove out there under the pretext of attending a party somewhere between Azusa and Pasadena. Everybody except Solo knew what was going to happen. They were all in on it. And they all played a part in rocking him to sleep. You know, on the other hand, there was no reason for Solo to believe that he was in any kind of trouble or that he was in imminent danger. But they still did what they could to make him feel at ease. You know, while they were driving, everybody seemed to be in high spirits, talking, laughing, and smoking blunts that Joker had specifically brought for the ride. You know, this was almost like feeding and fattening up the target before the slaughter. You know, it's a cold game, but betrayal always comes from the people that claim to be your friends or those who act like they have your best interests at heart. But one of the craziest and most sinister things about it is that the people that participate in that level of betrayal, they don't even see the shadiness and the underhanded part about it until that same energy is eventually turned on them. But until that happens, their way of thinking leads them to believe that they're doing an honorable thing, that somehow turning on one of your own and taking him out for his indiscretions is somehow doing an honorable thing. So Cub had already been out to this area on several other occasions, so he was familiar with that area. It's an area that's marked mile marker 2227. And then when he finally got there, he pulled over on the side of the road just like he planned. And then everybody else started to get out of the car, almost like this was scripted. Joker started to roll another blunt, and then the others all gathered around and started doing lines of Chris. So at one point, Cub and Trubs returned to the car. And while they were there in the car, Cub told Trubs that Crook was going to shoot Solo any minute now. So from the rearview mirror, Cub watched Joker walk towards Crook and Solo and then stand in front of Solo. And then Cub saw Crook walk behind Solo and shoot him in the back of the head. Solo never even knew what hit him. He dropped immediately to the ground right where he was standing. And that's where he'd stay. They didn't try to move him, they didn't try to cover him up, they didn't do nothing. They just got back in the car and they left. So the ride back to Cub's apartment was obviously and clearly a lot different from the ride there. The mood was somber. Nobody was laughing, telling jokes, or smoking blunts. Everybody was stuck in their own thoughts. And who knows what they were thinking. It might have been regret, it might have been guilt, it might have been fear of getting caught, or questioning themselves about who might possibly be the weakest link. The one who might flip the script and go to law enforcement, believing that they needed to be the first one to do it before someone else beat them to the punch. You know, these kinds of things can get ugly, and it can cause you to think too much if you're not mentally strong and committed to this type of lifestyle. So they ended up getting back to Cub's apartment sometime around 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. in the morning. And when they got there, Crook removed a semi-automatic 22 caliber handgun, cleaned it, and placed it on the refrigerator in Cub's apartment. In case you guys forgot, Carmen was Cub's and Tracy's other friend that was also living at the apartment. And by this time, Crook and Carmen were involved in an intimate relationship. You know, I don't know why Crook felt the need to expose this to Carmen, but I'm assuming it was because he either felt guilty or he was trying to impress her. Cub, on the other hand, was visibly shaking when he walked into his bedroom and told his wife Tracy that Solo had been shot. So fast forward a couple weeks after the shooting. A couple weeks after the shooting, Trubs goes by Cub's apartment and he basically threatens him. And he threatened him because apparently Cub started acting funny and Trubs thought he might possibly be a rat. You know, I don't know what Trubs was basing this on, but Cub probably started to pull back and started acting different. But Cub only needed to be threatened one time before he got the message and moved out of his apartment. So anyways, DOT workers, or Department of Transportation workers, found Solo's body in the Sousa Canyon on the morning of January 15, 1999. A live 22 caliber shell was found within a few feet of his body. So later on, a medical examiner determined that Solo died from a single gunshot wound to the head. So it was at this point that the homicide detectives began to put together this intricate puzzle and connecting all the dots of everybody that they believed was involved. And one of the first things that they did, that they always do in these types of big gang cases, especially when there's a conspiracy, is to start looking at phone records. And from looking at phone records, they were able to determine that Dozer called Cub's apartment from the LA County Jail 7 times between January 5th, 1998 and January 15th, 1998. And the calls range from 1 minute to 30 minutes. You know, keep in mind that this was the starting point, because as soon as this happened, they knew that Dozer was involved. And this was just based on the fact that Solo was his co-defendant and that he might have been considering cooperating in the double homicide that Dozer was charged with. You know, I'm not going to go deep into the details of the trial, but just to give you guys an idea of how it went, I'm just going to say this. You know, like most of these gang cases, they always bring in a law enforcement officer that either has an extensive amount of knowledge about the gang or a lot of experience working in the area where that gang's from. And obviously in this case, it was Whittier. So they brought in a detective by the name of Kurt Levson, who was not only raised in Whittier, but also worked in that area as law enforcement as well. And of course, he was familiar with all the players: Dozer, Trubs, Crook, Sniper, Cub, Joker, Listo, Solo, Bucky, Oso, Youngster, Diablo, and several others. You know, unfortunately for Dozer, he had a long list of people who were all lined up to testify against him. Everything from gang members to former gang members, confidential informants, civilians, Good Samaritans, girlfriends and wives of some of the people involved. And needless to say, they cooked him. The evidence was so overwhelming that Dozer's attorney didn't even try to fight the fact that he was involved and that he was one of the primary reasons why Solo's homicide occurred. Instead, his angle was to claim that Dozer may have communicated to stop Solo from becoming to be a CI against him, but that he never gave anyone an order to take him out, and therefore he can't be charged with his homicide. At any rate, on February 1st, 2001, Dozer was convicted of the 1997 gang-related double homicide of 2 teenagers, as well as ordering the homicide of Solo. And then on February 7, 2001, he was transported to San Quentin State Prison. You know, as we all know, death row has since been moved out of San Quentin State Prison, and as of a few years ago, all the condemned inmates are now dispersed throughout different prisons in the state of California. But when Dozer was still in San Quentin, he ended up making headline news twice for assaulting 2 different COs. So on January 25, 2006, as a correctional officer was locking Dozer in his cell after returning from the shower, Dozer spun around in his cell, reached through the tray slot, grabbed the CO's arm, and then sliced him with the razor. The damage ended up being a deep laceration that extended almost to the bone and required 30 stitches to close. Then almost 10 years later, on October 3, 2016, in what was referred to as the shower incident, this time Dozer was housed in East Block and was locked in a shower stall during regular program showers. And apparently while the officer was attempting to remove Dozer's handcuffs, Dozer spun around, reached through the tray slot, grabbed the CO's arm, and sliced him the same way that he sliced the other CO in the adjustment center. And like the other officer, the second officer also suffered a bone-deep laceration and required a number of stitches to close his wound. But right now, Dozer's housed somewhere in Tehachapi State Prison. I'm not sure what yard or what kind of yard, but that's where he's at. Anyways, there's a lot to take away from this story. I'm sure you guys can determine the positives and the negatives for yourselves. But again, more lives destroyed and more lives lost, all behind a broken belief system and a lifestyle that offers no real future or nothing fruitful to gain. So Dozer's future will amount to nothing more than a life sentence in state prison or the death penalty if his appeals fail him. Solo, on the other hand, met his demise prematurely, although some would argue that he got what he signed up for. I guess it's just a matter of perspective. But in closing, one thing's for sure, and I'm pretty sure that most of you will agree with me on this. Life has so much more to offer than the things that you heard about in this story. Hopefully some of you out there will end up being some of the lucky ones who end up figuring this out for yourselves, opposed to those of you whose blinders will end up coming off years later when it's far too late. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you liked this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this episode, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. And again, something else that's extremely important that I'm going to continue to keep reminding you guys about is to not only hit the like, drop a comment, and share the video, but also hit the all symbol on the notification bell so that you can be notified whenever I drop content on the channel. So with that being said, I just want to thank those of you who continue to show your unwavering loyalty and for also continuing to tap into the channel. In the meantime, you guys enjoy the rest of your day and keep pushing that positivity. Until the next one, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.